Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It begins in the hills of rural Appalachia, where whispers travel faster than the wind and the silence of the woods hides stories no one dares repeat out loud. Picture a small town, unmarked on most maps, where the families had lived for centuries, marrying into one another until the names themselves grew tangled. In a house that smelled of damp earth and burning coal, a boy was born under circumstances so unnatural, so disturbing, that his very existence felt like a curse passed down through the generations. They said his sister gave birth to him. They said the bloodlines had doubled back on themselves until the family tree no longer branched, but coiled like a snake eating its own tail. For decades, locals tried to deny it. They buried it under layers of silence, as if silence could erase what had happened, but the truth always leaves a trail, faint at first, then impossible to ignore. Children whispered it in the schoolyard, their parents shushed them, and preachers warned that some sins were too monstrous for forgiveness. Yet the boy grew up in that same town, walking its dirt roads, living in the shadow of his own origin story. No one spoke to him about it directly. No one dared. But he could feel the eyes following him, the judgment pressing down heavier than any sermon. Every family has secrets, but this one was different. This one was not a whispered affair or a hidden crime. This was a birth that defied morality itself. His mother and his sister, two titles fused into one. His bloodline folding in on itself until every relative was both too close and not close enough. The boy's very face carried the evidence, features that seemed off-kilt. Eyes too far apart, skin pale and stretched. People recoiled without knowing why, sensing something unnatural before they even heard the story. And yet, it wasn't just about one child. It was about the soil he was born into, the culture of isolation, the way entire families cut off from the world can transform into something that feels less than human, yet tragically human all the same. To understand him, you have to understand the land that made him. A place where poverty, religion, and bloodlines twisted together until the unthinkable became not only possible, but inevitable. To outsiders, the story of this boy sounded like a grotesque rumor, the kind of thing cruel children invent to make sense of someone who looks different, who acts different, who doesn't quite belong. But those who lived in the town knew better. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, though they would never admit it in public. It wasn't just about one strange birth. It was about generations of choices that had tightened like a noose around the family name. Inbreeding was not spoken of as a word. It was disguised under softer language like keeping to our own or family staying close. But under that polite phrasing was a brutal reality, marriages between cousins, uncles, and in the darkest whispers, even siblings. This wasn't unique to Appalachia. Hidden histories of inbreeding can be found in royal bloodlines, in isolated European villages, in desert tribes cut off by geography. Yet here in America, in the land of progress and freedom, it took root in forgotten towns where roads ended in dirt and futures ended too soon. The boy's mother, his sister, was herself a victim of the cycle, a girl born into silence, told that loyalty to family was the highest virtue, that leaving was betrayal, and that obedience was love. There are no clear records of how she became pregnant with her own brother's child. Some believe it was an accident of opportunity in a house where privacy did not exist. Others whisper it was forced upon her, an act of domination masquerading as family duty. Whatever the truth, she carried the child to term, and when the cries filled that old house, they echoed not just as the sound of new life, but as a generational curse made flesh. The child grew up knowing something was wrong, even before he could put it into words. His body carried the marks, slight deformities, weak bones, a jaw that never aligned. His mind too seemed touched by shadows, bursts of brilliance in some moments, confusion in others, as if his very brain could not decide whether to flourish or fail. People would say he was cursed, but in reality he was a victim of mathematics. Genes that should have been spread out across a wide pool had been folded again and again until the defects were written into his very DNA. And this is where the story turns darker, because in places like this, once a cycle begins, it doesn't end with one child. It festers, it repeats, and soon an entire bloodline becomes known not for what they've achieved, but for what they've lost. By the time the boy reached his teenage years, his reputation preceded him. He never needed to tell anyone who he was. The town already knew. He could feel it in the way conversations stopped when he walked by, the way neighbors pulled their children closer, the way even the church pew seemed to leave space around him, as if the air itself recoiled. In places like this, silence is not mercy. It is judgment wrapped in politeness, cruelty disguised as avoidance. He would walk to the general store, eyes on the dirt floorboards, never daring to meet the gaze of the shopkeeper. Coins would be placed on the counter, goods slid across without a word, and he would leave with the same feeling each time, that he was not a customer, but a tolerated ghost. His last name was a scar, his very existence a reminder of something everyone wanted forgotten. And yet, he was still there, breathing, watching, carrying the weight of a sin he had not chosen. The cruelest part of his life was not what people said, but what they didn't. Children taunted him with riddles they didn't fully understand, repeating words they'd heard whispered at home. Adults, on the other hand, treated him as if he was both invisible and dangerous, someone to pity and to fear all at once. When he tried to make friends, he was met with the same sharp reminder, "You are not like us." The irony, of course, was that he was exactly like them, born of the same soil, the same history, the same isolation. But unlike them, his face carried the family's darkest truth. As he grew older, the deformities became more pronounced. His teeth never aligned, his speech slurred, his body frail and bent. Some days he tried to fight against it, to carry himself tall and strong, but his own reflection betrayed him, and yet he was not without intelligence. In moments he displayed an eerie awareness, a piercing insight that unsettled those who dared to speak with him. It was as though his suffering had sharpened him in strange, unpredictable ways. Some believed he saw things others couldn't, that he was cursed with a second sight, born not just of blood, but of shame. But the truth is far simpler and far crueler. He was the byproduct of choices made long before he was born. He carried the sins of others, worn openly in the shape of his skull, the sound of his voice, the way his hands trembled. And though he bore no fault, he became the evidence of what happens when silence breeds silence, when shame festers in hidden corners, when families lock their doors not just to the world, but to the truth. As time moved forward, the boy became a man, though in the eyes of the town, he never truly crossed that threshold. He was frozen in place, forever defined by the circumstances of his birth. Where others grew into husbands, fathers, workers with steady hands and calloused palms, he remained the outcast, unfit for labor, unfit for love, unfit for the rituals of ordinary life. His body betrayed him with every passing year, fragile bones that broke too easily, a mind that drifted between clarity and confusion, features that unsettled strangers at first glance. He was a man who looked both too old and too young, as if time itself refused to know what to do with him. There were stories, always stories. Some said he wandered the woods at night, muttering to himself, speaking with voices no one else could hear. Others claimed he kept journals filled with ramblings, strange sketches, maps of the town marked with symbols no one understood. And then there were darker rumors, whispers that he had grown violent, that he was capable of lashing out without reason. None of it was ever confirmed, because the truth was both simpler and more disturbing. He was alone, utterly, painfully alone. Isolation is its own kind of death. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into years, each one erasing another piece of him. Without companionship, without purpose, without the gentle weight of belonging, he unraveled. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in sharp, dramatic breaks. He tried attending church, but the congregation's polite distance reminded him he was never one of them. He tried working odd jobs, but weakness and whispers followed him everywhere. Eventually he stopped trying. He became a fixture of the town's background, a shadow people glimpsed from porches and storefronts, a reminder of what happens when shame is allowed to take human form. Yet even in his brokenness, he held a strange power. People were fascinated by him, even as they avoided him. His presence carried with it the unspoken question no one dared to answer. How close are we, all of us, to becoming like him? For the truth is that inbreeding was not his crime nor his choice. It was a pattern repeated for generations. And patterns, once set in motion, are never as far from us as we'd like to believe. The man lived as both warning and punishment. He bore the weight of sins not his own, yet everyone else bore the weight of seeing him, of being reminded that beneath every polished family story lies something darker, something no one wants unearthed. There comes a point in every buried history when silence cracks. For this man, it happened not through confession, but through curiosity. Outsiders began to take notice. Researchers, journalists, and documentarians found their way into the town, hungry for proof of the whispers that had passed through generations like wildfire. At first, the community resisted, slamming doors, warning strangers to leave, insisting that nothing unusual had ever happened here. But the cameras stayed, the questions grew sharper, and slowly, fragments of the story began to surface. The man himself became an unwilling symbol. Photographs of his face circulated, haunting, distorted, unforgettable. Strangers who never knew his name labeled him the most inbred man alive. His humanity was stripped away, replaced with fascination, disgust, pity. He was reduced to an exhibit, proof of what happens when bloodlines turn in on themselves. For the town, this was humiliation. For him, it was exposure. The secret he had carried his entire life was now paraded across newspapers, screens, whispered about in classrooms, dissected by people who would never step foot in his world. And yet, through the cruelty of it, one truth remained. He did not create his curse. He was born into it. His story was not just a spectacle, but a warning, one written into his very bones. Generations of silence had led to this. Generations of denial had shaped his face, his body, his fate. The shame that had been confined to one town now stood as a mirror for anyone willing to look. This is the moment where the story becomes unbearable, because it forces us to confront something we'd rather not see. That the sins of families do not vanish. They ripple forward, breaking into the lives of those who never chose them. That shame does not dissolve with time. It mutates, grows, and waits for the moment when it can no longer be hidden. He was not a monster, though that's what many chose to call him. He was evidence. Evidence that silence breeds monsters out of ordinary people. Evidence that turning away does not erase the truth. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? As the years dragged on, the man faded deeper into obscurity, but the legend around him only grew. He became more story than person, his name lost in favor of titles whispered with both horror and fascination. The cursed child, the brother-son, the most inbred man alive. People spoke of him as if he were not human, as if reducing him to a myth could soften the unbearable truth of his life. But he was real, flesh and blood. A man who woke each morning with a body that betrayed him, a mind that carried scars no one could see, and a heart that had never known true love. He lived without family, though his entire life had been defined by them. The very people who should have nurtured him had instead created him as a living consequence of silence and sin. When they died, he inherited only their shadows. A collapsing house on the edge of town, filled with the smell of rot and dust, became his prison. Some nights children dared each other to approach it, to glimpse the man inside through broken windows. They said he stared back with eyes too wide, too pale, as if he carried the ghosts of everyone who had come before him. And yet there were small signs that he resisted complete erasure. He kept records, scraps of paper, photographs, old Bibles marked with shaking handwriting. He traced his lineage backward, trying to untangle the knots of kinship that had twisted until sister became mother, uncle became father, cousin became spouse. Perhaps it was his way of finding sense in the madness, or perhaps it was his attempt to prove to the world and to himself that he was not just a monster, but part of a story too large for any one person to bear. The tragedy is that no matter how much he searched, there was no redemption waiting in those family trees. Each branch led back into itself, curling inward, suffocating. And as he aged, his own body began to collapse the same way. Bone was breaking, speech faltering, memories slipping. By the end, he was a husk of the boy who had once walked into that general store with eyes fixed on the floorboards. Alone, fragile, yet still burdened with the weight of an entire bloodline's sins. This is what happens when history is ignored. It does not vanish. It festers in secret until one day it steps into the light, wearing the face of a man who never asked to be born. When the man finally passed away, there were no headlines in his town, no obituaries penned in local papers. His death was treated the same way his life had been, with silence. But the silence did not hold. Outside of the hills, his story continued to spread, carried on the breath of strangers who had never met him but could not look away from his face, his fate, his curse. He was gone, yet he lived on as a symbol of something people could not bear to face in themselves. The cost of secrets, the weight of shame, the way families will sacrifice truth to preserve their own fragile image. In the years since, researchers and historians have traced back the patterns, trying to understand how such a thing could have happened in modern America. The answer is both simple and chilling. Isolation breeds silence, silence breeds secrecy, and secrecy, when passed down like an inheritance, leads to horrors that no one dares put into words. His life was not an accident. It was the product of an environment where no one spoke, no one intervened, no one broke the cycle. He was not just one man. He was the final page in a story that had begun generations before him. Even today, the town rarely speaks his name. They talk instead of coal mines and poverty, of hard winters and survival. But if you linger long enough, if you press the right questions, you'll hear it in the pause, in the drop of a voice, in the nervous shift of a glance. They remember. They remember the boy born of his sister. They remember the face that carried the weight of all their sins. They remember, even if they'll never admit it. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. His story is not just about one man. It is about what happens when shame replaces honesty, when fear replaces compassion, when a family chooses silence over salvation. He was never meant to live the way he did. He was never meant to carry what he carried. But he did. And now, so do we. Because once you've heard his story, once you've seen his face in your mind, you can't unhear it. You can't look away. You carry it forward, the way his town still does, the way his blood once carried the weight of all those who came before him. His life may be over, but the secret he embodied has already passed to you.